Hello! Today I'm taking a look at Metal Gear Solid 3 Snake Eater, a game which many regard as a return to form for Hideo Kojima, following his contentiously received Metal Gear Solid 2, and in its own way, an interesting departure from the games that had come before it. Now, Snake Eater was an interesting evolution and transition for the series in a number of ways, and many consider it as a sort of apology to fans, following the dense meta-narratives and relative absence of our legacy hero Snake, which we'd seen in the previous title, MGS 2. And returning to the roots of the series is exactly what Kojima offered here, not just in terms of, installing a snake as a returning hero and having a slightly more straightforward and understandable story, but we also return to the roots of the series in terms of setting and historical context. And rather than a contemporary Solid Snake game, Snake Eater instead ventures back into the fulcrum of Cold War activity in the early 1960s and explores the origins of Big Boss, Foxhound, and the Metal Gear weapon itself in what is essentially a historical period piece. And this precipitates and sets in motion, the events that lead up to the nightmarish military dystopia, that the MGS world went on to become, culminating in Metal Gear Solid 4. So, I think all of this is done very well, and rather than slipping into a contrived, clumsy pastiche of Metal Gear Solid 1 and suffering the pitfalls of apologetic fan service, MGS 3 hit all of the right notes in terms of an exciting origin story, which features Big Boss, Ocelot and others, new and engaging gameplay that focuses on survival tactics and camouflage, while at the same time not taking itself too seriously and maintaining this delicate balance that's particular to the series, which is, kind of sincere and emotive themes, drama and character arcs, which are thrown together with self-aware humour that is often tongue-in-cheek and slightly ridiculous in nature. So in this episode, I'll once again dive into the intricacies of themes, character, setting and gameplay, and how Snake Eater proved in many ways an innovative departure, yet at the same time an exciting continuity of the Metal Gear Solid saga. So, kicking off, and as I've touched on, the historical setting and chronological departure from the previous games is the most immediate difference to Metal Gear Solid 3. Sneaking suits, codecs, and metabolism-controlling nanomachines are switched out for prototypical or traditional equivalents, such as camouflage, radio, and hunting for food, all of which inform new gameplay techniques. And looking at how the 1960s historical context informs story, we are shifted out of a dystopian future, featuring fictional US presidents such as Solidus and James Johnson, and are instead planted firmly within a relatively accurate real-world history, featuring Nikita Khrushchev, Lyndon B. Johnson, and the turbulent East-West politics of the time following JFK's assassination, and Khrushchev's increasingly tenuous grip on power during this period owing to Soviet factionalism and infighting at the Kremlin. And indeed, as I'll touch on later, the primary antagonist, Volgin, is allied to the rebellious Commissar Brezhnev, who did indeed eventually usurp Khrushchev as leader of the Soviet Union, and ended this heated period that we're playing through, as Naked Snake. This game goes so far as to show Johnson and Khrushchev in a fictionalized telephone conversation, which was an unprecedented move for the series, because where Metal Gear Solid has often used the history of war, politics and international relations as a theatrical backdrop to lend some plausibility to the story, it has never ventured to lift the curtain on that historical facade by depicting actual people, that were involved in these events. Which is often risky because we have the grounds of authenticity, voice acting, respect to a surviving family, and a range of other things that could, impact depicting actual people. But having said that, the curt exchange between Johnson and Khrushchev feels very true to form, with the latter being portrayed as an unbending, brash Soviet leader, happy to bulldoze discussions to get what he wants, much like the real Khrushchev, who was renowned for a number of indiscretions, such as purportedly banging his shoe on the table at a UN meeting whenever he felt undermined. The fact that Snake Eater deals entirely within the realms of espionage and covert missions also helps matters, because the Cold War was known for back-channel talks between politicians, and owing to the clandestine nature of the period, there's nothing that overtly ratifies or dismisses the plausibility of such a telephone exchange between Khrushchev and Johnson taking place, and the history and the narrative complement one another quite well in this regard, I think. Beyond the historical leaders and period of the story, which serve as a backdrop for the events to take place, the game hinges primarily on character arcs and character relationships that are explored through incidental and recurring encounters throughout the game. And Snake's often turbulent interactions with others, particularly Ava, Ocelot, and the boss, is what propels things forward, rather than the duplicitous twists and turns and macro politics of the previous two titles. And in my opinion, this is what makes Snake Eater such an interesting title, because due to its nature as a prequel and an origin story, in many ways the complexities of the future events are stripped right back to a simpler time. And indeed, many of the characters that feature in this game are the ones who go on to perpetrate the sinister events of the future that Solid Snake is forced to contend with. This leads me on to my second point about setting, which is that we play retrospectively as Naked Snake, who would go on to become Big Boss in the later chronology of the series. Now, up to this point in the MGS saga, Big Boss was comfortably considered as a central antagonist, ambiguous thanks to subtle retcons and minimal screen time, but nonetheless regarded as the antithesis to the liberator Solid Snake and the freedom that he strove for. In Snake Eater, we now find ourselves thrust into a world where Big Boss is not only a hero and our player character, but more than that, we find him to be an entirely likeable and good-natured protagonist too. As such, I feel this prequel installment beautifully illustrates a central thematic thread throughout the series, which is that there is no clear-cut good and bad, or definitive protagonist and antagonist, but rather the world is divided along much more complicated lines of ideology, allegiance, and belief, which I touched on in my MGS1 retrospective, and it makes most characters flawed and human in a certain respect, but also confusing as well, because they transcend simplified narrative conventions of hero, villain, good, evil, self, and other, and leave many asking to this day, is Big Boss a bad guy? Is Zero a good guy? And what the hell is going on with Ocelot? This murkiness is amplified throughout Snake Eater, and specifically by the enigmatic character of the boss, who during the prologue of the game is seen to defect to the Soviet Union. And to paraphrase her, she states that there's no such thing as an absolute timeless enemy, but humans only become enemies in relative terms. And this idea is neatly illustrated by the boss's alliance of convenience with the Soviet Union and her ill-fated relationship with the Sorrow, but actually I think perfectly crystallised by the fact we are playing as a snake who, in this game, we would consider as a hero, but who would go on to become a perceived antagonist in the later chronology of the series, as seen in the earlier titles. In Naked Snake's confused relationship and destined defeat of the boss, we are also seeing another core thread of the MGS series explored, which is this self-perpetuating Oedipal loop that the narrative hinges around, wherein the hero is perpetually at odds with a paternal figure, such as Raiden and Solidus, Solid and Big Boss, and Naked Snake and the maternal figure of the boss, which I'll discuss more shortly. But suffice to say, Snake Eater's ability to have thoroughly likeable and not necessarily evil bad guys, such as the boss and Ocelot, simply shows how this game and series as a whole operates in very unconventional terms when it comes to perceptions of good and bad. And the ambiguity of characters such as Ocelot, Granin, the boss, and so on, is amplified when set beside caricature villains such as Volgin, who revels in evil plans, maniacal laughs, and just generally enjoys being a complete bastard to everyone. So let's delve a little deeper into these characters now, because, as I mentioned, this game hinges heavily on character relationships and the friction of these interactions, rather than any specific twists and turns, which Metal Gear Solid 1 and 2 relied upon quite heavily. Indeed, where these previous installments were sparsely populated with characters in the field, and relationships and betrayals occur mostly over the codec, such as Master Miller, the infamous AI, Colonel Campbell, and so on. Metal Gear Solid 3 sees much more action, drama, and discussion take place in the tangible setting of the Russian wilderness, with Ava and the boss and everyone else kind of directly interfacing with Naked Snake. And kicking off with Ava, she contributes greatly to the mood and story of the game, as well as our perception of Snake. And relating back to the Cold War setting, MGS3 combines the murkiness of real-world history and historical figures with a more sensationalist pop culture idea of the Cold War, as seen in Hollywood movies, John le Carré novels, and perhaps most famously, Ian Fleming's creation, James Bond. Indeed, just looking at the opening credits of Snake Eater and the eponymous soundtrack, which echoes the over-the-top sexy ballads of the Bond franchise, such as Shirley Bassey's Goldfinger, and it's also complemented by the abstract silhouettes and montages of our hero, MGS3 was an indiscreet nod to Cold War cinema and this rich heritage of James Bond media forged in Pinewood Studios. But looking at Ava now, she fits the bill as a quintessential Bond girl, and while many compare MGS3 to MGS1's set pieces, such as Meryl and Ava and whatnot, I think far from being a Meryl-esque romantic foil who's a rookie in constant need of rescue, Ava is cut from the same cloth as many of James Bond's sidekicks, as a curious blend of assertive personality, such as masculine traits and attire and a penchant for combat, all of which Ava has, from her military outfit to her proficiency with usually masculine machina, such as firearms and motorcycles. But this is fused with and embodies a certain sexual suggestiveness and a sense of patriarchal accessibility that would usually play right into the hands of the lascivious James Bond. And indeed, Ava embodies this sexuality through both her military attire, which is impractically unzipped to reveal both cleavage and navel, and in multiple instances she all but throws herself at Snake. But where Bond wouldn't think twice to indulge this, hedonistic conventions are actually pleasantly abandoned in Metal Gear Solid 3, with Snake proving a somewhat uncomfortable, stoic, and seemingly impotent professional who values the mission over any discursive fraternization of the flesh. Indeed, in an early scene designed to illustrate this point, Ava presents Snake with a customized firearm, which, unlike her sexual advances, sees him erupt with excitability with its range of modifications and whatnot, and he maintains this retentive beta male demeanour with Ava until basically the end of the game, when they finally sleep together. So, there's been plenty of discussion as to Snake's disposition towards Ava and why he's so retentive. For my part, I think it serves to show his conduct and formidable future reputation as the greatest soldier of the 20th century. The reason he warranted cloning in the Les Enfants Terribles project is precisely his military aptitude and his focus on the mission. And instead, sex, much like warmth, food, and every other human necessity on Maslow's hierarchy of needs, is just another comfort that he sacrifices for the sake of a mission. And I think one of the most ridiculous elements of humour thrown into the game is in a moment when they're alone together in a cave, edging towards a romantic moment. A humorous cutscene replaces this with Ava stretching out Snake in the shadows on the cave wall in a kind of fake wrestling match. It's really bizarre and a very purposefully contrived piece of comedy, to kind of replace what would otherwise perhaps be a sexual encounter. Furthermore, I think Snake's almost childlike innocence and beta status in the game is symbolic of him being a protege and living in the shadow of the matriarchal figure of the boss. And she states in the game, and a recurring theme in the series, is that there's only room for one Snake and one boss. And this has an alpha-beta, dominant, submissive sort of vibe to it that Snake must overcome to finally mature. And it's prudent to note that Snake only sleeps with Ava after he's defeated the boss, thus assuming, this metaphorical manhood and alpha dominance, for the first time in his life. But again, that's merely my impression of the game and its subtext. But I think the boss's shadow looms large over Snake, outdoing him in every altercation until the very end. And I think that would account for his actions and his personality during the game, which I'll touch on a bit more shortly. Returning to Ava, aside from these Bond-esque aesthetics, she's quite a significant cog in the murky Cold War espionage we play through. She propels the plot forward in numerous places, and again, in an intriguing switch-up of gender roles, she is often responsible for rescuing Snake from some sticky situations. However, despite this seeming empowerment, there's also an ugly and uncomfortable angle to Ava's femininity on the battlefield, with Volgin taking her as a war prize in her deep cover role as Titania, and Ava willingly indulging this in order to maintain her cover and gather information, even mentioning to Snake that she would fall in love if it was required of her. It plays into this theme of patriotism and sacrifice that governs Metal Gear Solid 3, and importantly it contrasts her classical femme fatale femininity with the other female lead, which is the formidable character of the boss, who I will discuss directly. But on the note of Ava's role as Titania, another thing I loved is Ocelot's suspicions of her, and each interaction of him kind of sniffing her, probing her, and interrogating her is filled with suspense, not least because many Bond girls end up getting killed in the James Bond movies, but also because at the time of this game's release, there's no reference to Ava in any of the wider franchise, and as a standalone origin story, we're very conscious as players that everyone besides Snake and Ocelot are potentially expendable. Now, moving on to the boss, she is a fantastic character to discuss, particularly in comparison to Ava, and more generally as a contribution to the game story, and potentially the wider world of gaming, in general. She's crafted with such a formidable mystique, self-assurance, and quiet competence that she absolutely holds sway in every scene that she features in, and she's very much the focal point of every environment that she inhabits. In each altercation with Snake, who is himself a well-trained CIA operative, we see him disarmed and outclassed as if he was nothing more than a rookie, and indeed even Volgin, who is little more than a mad dog, is uncharacteristically attentive to the boss's words in the small instances where we see them interact. And although the boss doesn't speak or appear that much in the game, every action and reaction to her quietly amplifies the legend of her character. Snake is a formidable soldier who gets easily outclassed, and Volgin is this loud maniac who becomes quiet and obedient whenever she's in the room. And it's these uncharacteristic reactions to the boss that contribute to her personality and her presence in the game, which is complemented by her fierce notion of loyalty in the game and this self-sacrificial patriotism. Now, to digress slightly, another thing that I think she does well, again in stark comparison to Ava, is really strip away the James Bond stereotypes of sexuality and feminine subservience that often populates games, Hollywood, and wider pop culture. And I'd like to prefix by saying that I'm not particularly political, and I'm not angling at anything political here, and I'm quite reluctant to wade into a heavy discourse on what constitutes feminism, because, I'm not really an expert. But I think it can be agreed that, historically speaking, female representation in movies, games, and media is relatively homogenous and quite two-dimensional. And even in today's renaissance of female protagonists, like in The Hunger Games or Tomb Raider or Ghost in the Shell, there's a weird dichotomy at work where, ladies can kick ass, but generally they have to kind of wear tight outfits and look sexy doing it. So there's a weird thing going on where there's a certain autonomy and empowerment, but boiling it down, it still works to appeal or is in deference to, the opposite sex. And looping back round to the boss, I think she's a fantastic example of autonomous female empowerment and a three-dimensional personality done really well. And it's not that she's presented as masculine or butch or sexless or presented as anything other than she is. And, she is shown to be both a mother and a lover, but it's the fact that her other attributes, such as her patriotism, her stoicism, and her athleticism, are the focus of her character, rather than any of the other stuff, such as, sexuality, that makes her so interesting. And indeed, some comparative characters that I'd put on a par with the boss are Sigourney Weaver's character of Ripley in Alien, who I consider to be one of the best female leads I've ever seen come out of Hollywood, along with Pam Grier's Jackie Brown and Uma Thurman's Beatrix Kiddo in Kill Bill, who is admittedly fetishized in several places of that film, but is generally characterized by the theme of revenge over more stereotypically feminine traits or sexuality. And indeed, much like Beatrix in Kill Bill, the boss actually kills her lover, the Sorrow, in an act that eradicates this masculine deference and assures her independence and intrigue throughout the story in a very organic and unforced feministic way. So, that aside, returning to her character, she's offered depth, complexity, and this muddling anti-hero status that makes her immediately intriguing and likeable, but also somewhat mysterious. Her early betrayal of Snake during the Virtuous mission perfectly exemplifies her muddling character. She's on opposing sides to Snake, and hints that she doesn't want to kill him, but when he fails to desist, she casts him off a bridge into the rapids below. And this repeats in almost every interaction that they have, wherein the boss simultaneously hints at warmth and pride in her protege, but doesn't shy away from causing him serious harm either. And it has this sort of tough love Spartan sentiment to it. And where Spartans would rigorously and brutally train their children in the agauge until part of the tribe, similarly the boss, even while an antagonist, treats Snake to this hard, militaristic education. So, as I mentioned earlier, the boss states that humans only become enemies in relative terms, and there's no such thing as an absolute enemy, which I think is one of the defining monologues of both Metal Gear Solid 3 and the wider Metal Gear Solid series. And there's this sort of sad fatedness bound up in the boss, because she knows she has this part to play as an aggressor for a grander cause, and she's ultimately betrayed by her countrymen, the CIA, which severely affects Naked Snake's perception, of the world and the people that he's allied with. And really, it could even be argued that the boss is a deuteragonist, or at least on a par with Naked Snake's significance in this game, because she's this prototypical legend who inspires and lays the foundations for her protege, who would go on to become Big Boss. And in turn, he would himself go on to be considered an enemy of the state for a grander cause. And this is the grand, the big wheel, the looping arc of the Metal Gear Solid storyline, which is inheriting the sins of the father in this eternal recurrence. One Snake and one boss, as is stated in the game. By contrast, the other antagonist, Volgin, is your run-of-the-mill Hollywood villain who wouldn't look out of place in a Jean-Claude Van Damme movie. He's just unequivocally, unslakably angry, evil and lustful and sadistic. And while his arbitrary villainy seems a bit hokey for some, I quite like it because, set alongside Ava, Ocelot and the boss, it amplifies their complexity, by his simplicity. And there's a scene where Volgin's torturing Snake in the basement alongside Ava, Boss and Ocelot. And in retrospect, it's interesting to look at that and think that everyone in that room is conspiring against him and a double or a triple agent. And it's only Volgin who has this very single-serving, quite straightforward, simple purpose. Furthermore, the character of Volgin is brilliantly written because, although he's somewhat straightforward, he's still wildly unpredictable, and his willingness to indiscriminately murder people makes him a very intimidating presence on screen, particularly in scenes when we see him nuking his own countrymen and beating Granning to death in a barrel. Returning to the historical leanings of MGS3, however, Volgin and his GRU unit are representative of the often ruthless and tempestuous relationship between the Soviet state leadership and the secret police, who were perpetually on hand to black bag and overthrow dissidents at the drop of a hat, even someone at the very top of the tree. And anyone interested in this borderline ridiculous fear caused by the secret police during the Soviet Union should watch the 2017 movie The Death of Stalin, which is a very satirical but hilarious and haunting look at how the Soviets filled power vacuums. In this instance, and as I mentioned earlier, Volgin is a member of the Brezhnev faction, and the reality of the situation is that Leonid Brezhnev did indeed constantly try and scupper Khrushchev's leadership of the USSR throughout the 1960s, and did eventually oust him as leader in 1964. So, once again, Hideo Kojima has woven the absurd and the improbable, of MGS fiction, such as this, electronic Volgin character, in with real-world events, giving Volgin a certain plausibility, at the very least in his raison d'etre, if nothing else. On the note of antagonists and absurdist elements, the comic book-esque Cobra unit are introduced, who fulfill this series convention of having a motley crew of outcasts, to contend our protagonist Snake, and serve as a series of boss fights. And for my part, I think these guys work so well for the role, because although they have comparatively less involvement in the central story, particularly if we look at, the antagonists of MGS 1 and 2, I think that they tick all the boxes and give us something entertaining to work our way through, by way of boss fights, and have an otherworldliness and harrowing backstory about them, which mixes the macabre with the absurd. And my personal favourite is the Fury, who's this deranged former cosmonaut of the USSR space program. But, we also have the End, who is a fantastic example of an innovative boss fight, but also emblematic of Kojima's irreverent approach to gaming, where the player is able to kill the End by saving the game during the battle, waiting for a week, and then turning the game on again, and he dies of old age. So, it's one of these very tongue-in-cheek things that Kojima and the MGS series does quite well. The Sorrow is another intriguing character who creepily persists throughout the game in player-prompted R1 button cutscenes, and he sets a precedent for this weird, sombre, sincere sort of character, wherein he's following his former lover around and ambiguously looming over events, seemingly assisting Snake with this grinning, Loki-esque sort of schadenfreude. And although he indulges the comically absurd, by holding up hints and tips, and even a timer for a bomb towards the end of the game, this is matched by his melancholic longing and eventual reunion with the boss at the end of the game, when she's finally defeated. So, having mentioned the boss and the Sorrow, the interesting lineage and generational nature of the MGS saga leads me neatly onto their progeny, Revolver Ocelot. And as I stated in my MGS2 retrospective, I feel that this guy could be held up alongside Snake as the second most significant character in the series, and certainly the most significant non-player character in the series. Metal Gear Solid 3 is a fantastic origin story, wherein we witness the birth of the man who would go on to become Revolver. And while we see him employ a crafty Machiavellian efficiency in his later years, MGS3 shows him as a capable, but ultimately prideful, naive, and tempestuous Spetsnaz commander, which proves his undoing when confronted with the prowess of the man he would later idolize, which is Big Boss, or in this case Naked Snake. Much like the uneasy dynamic between Snake and the boss, so too does the dynamic between Snake and Ocelot have the hint of a mentor-student relationship, despite being on opposing sides of the fence. It also maintains this sense of ideological heritage that features in the MGS series, wherein ideas are passed from Boss to Snake, from Snake to Ocelot, and later from Solid Snake to Raiden, and so on. And the fact that we witness Ocelot as this fiery, half-formed character really shows Big Boss's influence on him, all the way down to suggesting a revolver as Ocelot's primary firearm, owing to the way he twists his arm to absorb the recoil on his Makarov. And the revolver, of course, goes on to become synonymous with the character in the later chronology of MGS 1, 2 and 4. So I think Ocelot is brilliantly portrayed here, and I'm sure I'm not alone in finding him one of the most appealing characters to appear in the game series. But with Metal Gear Solid 3, we can see just how much development he goes through as the series progresses, because he's an extremely arrogant young soldier who theatrically waves his hands about and somewhat haplessly fumbles his attempts to kill Snake, usually because he's trying to show off. Indeed, even once he switches to his Colt revolver, his arrogance persists and is aptly conveyed by the fact he has his gun ornately engraved rather than just using a standard issue. In return, however, Snake offers honest critiques and hints when he defeats his adversary and sees him falling short. And by the end of the game, we see Ocelot begin this transition into a more practical and hardened, legitimate anti-hero, rather than this impudent foil who has fallen short throughout the game. All being said and done, however, it's prudent to remember that Ocelot is a triple agent serving numerous interests, including the CIA in this game. So his animosity towards Snake, particularly during Operation Snake Eater, is arguably, not legitimate for the most part. And right from the get-go, Ocelot has proven a very obtuse, impenetrable hero-villain character, who as a result I consider to be among the most interesting characters I've actually come across in games in general. So, looking at the aforementioned characters of Ava, Boss, and Ocelot, these three triangulate, and through their interactions they build up our idea of Naked Snake. Ava shows his timid reproach to romance on the battlefield. Ocelot shows his impartial nature between friend and foe, his martial aptitudes, and his willingness to console and teach. And most significantly, the Boss shows us the deference and reverence that he has for his tutor, in whose shadow he lives, and whose teachings he abides by. Some people have suggested on this point that Snake is perhaps romantically inclined towards the Boss, or vice versa. And personally speaking, that's never really the impression that I had from them, and I see it much more as a mother and son dynamic, if nothing else, with Snake being almost this surrogate son. And with this reading, we could even interpret that Snake and Ocelot and their interactions have this sort of subconscious sibling rivalry dynamic to it. But returning to the Snake who would go on to become Big Boss, Snake Eater is very much a journey of self-discovery for him. Or rather, I should say, it's the antithesis of self-discovery. It's almost the undoing of his belief, wherein, by the end of the game, his ideals and his patriotism are destroyed by the CIA's double-crossing of the Boss. So, Metal Gear Solid 3 ultimately ends on quite a somber note for Snake, who has now assumed, the rank of Big Boss, and it paves the way for player empathy and understanding of his actions, which would echo across the later titles, casting him in the role of an antagonist with his distrust of America and the very concept of nation-states, leading towards the concept of outer heaven and his renewed raison d'etre. Regarding personality, much has been made of Naked Snake compared to Solid Snake, with many preferring the comparatively light-hearted, joking innocence of the former, rather than this hard-boiled, slightly womanizing severity of Solid Snake, who we see in the later chronology. For my part, I like both of them, and I don't think there's much in it, to be honest, to distinguish between them. And ultimately, I think they're both very strong protagonists that carry their respective game titles forward. Turning to Snake's team, other peripheral characters that we have that are integral to the saga include Zero and his support network via radio. And most of these guys form the primordial group who would go on to inherit the Philosophers Legacy and become known as the Patriots, which again significantly echoes out and impacts the world by the time Metal Gear Solid 1 rolls around. And Zero, to zero in on him as it were, is another one of these interesting characters who goes on to become quite morbid and tragic and antagonistic, but actually in MGS3 is a source of hilarious conversation for the most part, whether it's his playing on English stereotypes about tea and biscuits, or making innuendos or unsubtle references to David Bowie, for example, with the Major Tom reference. There's rarely a radio conversation with him that isn't worth listening to, I think, owing to the brilliant voice acting and his quite pithy English dialogue. Paramedic similarly has amusing dialogue, and she serves as this sort of channeling of Hideo Kojima's love affair with Hollywood cinema by incessantly and constantly referencing movies that are contemporary with the game events. Regarding peripheral characters, we also have Sokolov and Granin, who propel the saga forward in their own subtle ways. And these two are representative of scientists of the time who were involved in the space race as an analogue to the arms race, and this ongoing conflict and one-upmanship between East and West. And I like that Sokolov and the Shagohod are the focal point of this game, because it breaks the repetition of having a Metal Gear weapon to contend with, but it also shows the harsh competitiveness between Soviet scientists, with Granin having fallen out of favour and proving a washed-up alcoholic by the time we encounter him, completely unaware that it's his concept of the Metal Gear and the walking battle tank that would actually succeed the failed Shagohod in the decades to come and change the face of the world as we know it within the Metal Gear saga. And instead of this, he is of course beaten to death inside a barrel by Volgin, which once again is one of those uncomfortable scenes which shows what a douchebag Volgin is, I suppose. So that's a brief look at the characters around which the game events largely orbit, and moving now into actual player involvement in the piece and the game mechanics. I was really impressed with how these developed from previous titles, but at the same time appeared retrofitted to be canonical with 1960s espionage. Immediately apparent is the removal of the codec, which made the game significantly more challenging, but also removed the distraction of simply staring at the radar to navigate your way through obstacles, which, the earlier games were quite partial to. Instead, every facet of gameplay in Snake Eater relies on a sense of finiteness and survival. The radars we are given are battery operated, which wear down over time, limiting their use. And similarly, Snake is required to hunt for food, which by turns assists him by restoring health and stamina, but it can also damage him if we consume something that's poisonous or disgusting. And finally, we have the medical interface, which allows us to patch up burns, splint fractures, and restore broken bones when Snake is significantly injured. So where earlier titles simply required rations to restore us, along with the occasional bandage or diazepam, Snake Eater takes a huge step forward in this theme of survival and espionage by having Snake literally, kind of having to fend for himself in all manner of speaking. Finally, we have the camouflage mechanic, which forms a central component of sneaking in gameplay. And unlike other Metal Gear games, the player spends much more time in the menus, customizing and adapting Snake to different foliage, settings and scenarios. And Metal Gear Solid 4, in its super modern approach, maintained the camouflage angle, but made it a much more automated process, so the player didn't have to dive into the menus quite so much. But on this note, looking at the comparatively manual process in Metal Gear Solid 3, it was an interesting and engaging concept, I think, that players enjoyed for the most part. And it also adds an additional minigame, because we're able to collect rare camouflages and customized camos with varying attributes, which was quite cool to try and do. Regarding the menu flow and navigating through these interfaces, the medical one, the camouflage one, along with others such as your animal cages, it's certainly not perfect, and it's quite a clunky, interface and journey. But compared to the future titles, with their increasing options, I'm playing MGS 5 at the moment, and every single button, including the analog sticks, does something for Snake. So looking back to MGS 3 from this modern standpoint, the equipment mechanics in Snake Eater were actually quite simple and, a walk in the park basically, really simple to use. Beyond the renewed focus on survival, the actual maps that we interact with returned to the linearity of MGS 1 rather than the circular big shell of MGS 2, or the comparatively open world that MGS 4 and 5 would later work towards. And indeed, I'd go so far as to say that MGS 3 is the most linear journey of any MGS game. But much like the first, each map is a unique terrain which we can interact with and sneak around in, whether it's a house or a bunker or a bridge or a stairwell. And there's always scope within this space to do something interesting or amusing, with a given set of outcomes for our obstacles or ways to kind of get around or assassinate guards, for example. So it maintains an interest and adds a longevity and replayability to the title, despite the linearity. And I think linearity is a bit of a dirty word these days, with everything striving towards a sort of homogeneous open world, whether you're looking at Red Dead 2, Witcher 3 or MGS 5. But I think linearity certainly has a place within gaming, and MGS 3 is linearity done very well, I think, in my opinion. Beyond this, even the gameplay has cameos and humour thrown in for good measure, with my personal favourite being Snake dying or killing Ocelot during their gun battle. And if this happens, a voiceover in the game screen, normally when they're screaming Snake, they tell us that we've created a time paradox, which is actually pretty amusing, because of course these two go on to survive into later events. And on the note of these interactions with Ocelot, graphically, the cutscenes and the CQC sequences that we see, such as Ocelot getting outmaneuvered by Snake, I mean, they are really beautifully done, even by the standards of today, looking back at the PlayStation 2. And Kojima's Hollywood-esque mise-en-scene and cinematography is absolutely on point, as usual. And even with the lengthier cutscenes, I think that they are engaging enough to hold player attention, because he manages to craft such a sense of mood, whether it's combat or something that's quite tense, and he manages to create a fantastic atmosphere, within what is essentially a PlayStation 2 video game. So, before wrapping up, I think it's worth noting on the music, which, much like previous titles, creates a fantastic sense of mood, whether it's stealth or caution or alert phases. Every sound, whether it's diegetic or non-diegetic, captures the essence of espionage and the Cold War period. And I think the infamous ladder climbing scene, where we maintain a single shot of Snake climbing out of the sewers, over this James Bond-esque Snake Eater soundtrack, is such a memorable and cathartic moment, and it's this lull in the action after a lengthy boss battle, which perfectly contextualizes Snake Eater's use of audio and cinematic pacing to create an iconic moment. And indeed, although I've only sparingly touched on the story here, focusing instead on the precedence of character interactions, I think it's worth noting here that Metal Gear Solid 3's pacing is absolutely fantastic, and where both MGS1 and MGS2 were criticised for repetition, backtracking, and occasional lulls in the action, which, teetered into tedium, I feel that Snake Eater manages to absolutely nail the relationship between action, stealth, and narrative reprieve with its evenly paced episodic story, which I suppose lends to its legacy as one of the best MGS titles to this day, for many. So, to conclude, Snake Eater strips back on the dense, duplicitous nature of the series, at least as much as a covert ops espionage game can, and allows itself to have a bit of fun, enjoying the story, enjoying its characters and its dialogue scenarios, without ever straying too far from the emotive thread of sincerity, which is maintained by Snake's uneasy relationship with the boss, and the ideas of patriotism, loyalty, allegiance that is bound up heavily in this Cold War title. The boss states prophetically in the closing act of the game, yesterday's ally becomes today's opposition, and I think this crystallises the perpetual moral greyness of this game series, and how what we might perceive as good or bad is simply a matter of perspective. The setting is of course shifted from the austere metallic warehouses of MGS 1 and 2 to the lush and lively jungles within the flux of Cold War Russia, and Kojima's fiction here is beautifully woven into the fabric of East-West relations, at the height of the Cold War. So in my opinion, Snake Eater is an exciting and enjoyable glimpse at Cold War history, buoyed up by the brilliant characters with particular regard to Snake, the boss, and Ocelot, and for many served as the last conventional MGS game before the irrevocable push towards futurism, open-world gameplay, and complex dystopian narrative ushered in by Metal Gear Solid 4. So that about does it. If you enjoyed the episode, please consider subscribing to keep updated with my latest posts. Feel free to share on social channels to help my channel grow, and drop a comment below with your own thoughts and opinions on the game.